What would you do if the one person you thought would always protect you suddenly cut off the last lifeline you had left? What if your own father, your king, decided that the support you depended on, the connection you believed was unbreakable, was no longer yours to claim? And worse, what if the moment it happened, you realized you had nowhere else to turn? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is where our story begins. Not in Buckingham Palace, not in Montecito, but in the space between expectation and reality, between entitlement and independence, between a father and a son who no longer know how to speak the same emotional language. Because today, we're diving into the moment Prince Harry found himself in precisely that position, facing what may be his most personal crisis since leaving the royal family. A moment where the headlines don't even scratch the surface of the truth. A moment when his private world shook harder than any public scandal ever could. Harry, the spare, who left to find freedom. Charles, the reluctant king, who waited his entire life to rule. Two men, two destinies, colliding at the exact moment when they needed each other the most. But instead of reconciliation, instead of healing, instead of unity, something very different happened. Harry's royal income was shut down, and according to sources close to the situation, and whispers that have grown louder over the past months, it wasn't just a cold financial decision. It wasn't just an administrative adjustment. It wasn't even a political calculation. It was personal. Now, as dramatic as that sounds, the deeper layers of this story make it even more explosive. Because hidden beneath the headlines, beneath the rumors, beneath the palace statements crafted to sound polished and neutral, lies a narrative that reveals the fractures within this family more clearly than ever before. Let me ask you something. When a father cuts off his son, is it a punishment or a message? And if it's a message, what exactly was King Charles trying to say? Before we answer that, we need to step back and understand why this moment matters so much. And why it's happening right now. Because this isn't simply about money. It never is. Not with the royals. This is about control, about loyalty, about identity, about the tension between being a family and being an institution. And yes, it's also about the pressure building inside the monarchy as it evolves under a new reign. For decades, Charles and Harry's relationship has been shaped by duty, expectation, and grief. Grief over Diana. Grief over lost time. Grief over a bond that was damaged long before Meghan ever entered the picture. But over the last 4 years, something undeniable happened. Harry pulled away. Charles held on. Then Charles let go. And now, Harry is reaching back. Not for power, not for status, but for help. The shocking part? Some insiders claim Charles didn't just cut off one of Harry's income streams. He cut off the last remaining one Harry thought was still secure. The one he believed was protected. The one that symbolized the faint connection to the life he once knew. And the timing? Absolutely brutal. Because Harry has been facing an increasingly unstable financial landscape behind closed doors. Deals drying up, contracts shifting, public image weakening, a lifestyle that costs more than most people can imagine, and a world that no longer bends for him the way it used to. So when Charles made his decision, it didn't just hit Harry's wallet. It struck his confidence, his identity, his sense of safety. That feeling that, no matter what happened publicly, privately, he still had something solid below his feet. Now imagine that pillar suddenly gone. It's enough to make anyone panic, even a prince. But here's the twist, and what makes this all the more compelling. Charles didn't make the decision alone. According to multiple accounts, he was advised, persuaded, even urged, and not just by palace officials or financial experts, but by someone inside the family. Someone who allegedly warned Charles that continuing to support Harry in any form might undermine the stability of the monarchy. Is that true? Or just another rumor stirred by palace insiders? That's the tension at the heart of this story. Because every pathway you follow leads to even more questions. Why now? Why cut Harry off at this particular moment? Was it retaliation? A boundary? A cry for accountability? A consequence of years of public criticism from Harry? Or was it something even deeper, like a father making a painful decision he's been avoiding for years? Every version paints a different picture, and each picture reveals something new about the fractured bond between father and son. But before we dive into the specifics of what Charles cut off, how he did it, and why the financial implications are so enormous for Harry's life in America, we need to understand something fundamental. This moment didn't happen in isolation. It didn't arrive suddenly or without warning. It's the result of choices made long ago. Words said, promises broken, trust weakened, and emotions buried under royal protocol and public expectations. Because a monarchy might operate like an institution, but its members still feel like a family. And when those worlds collide, the fallout can be devastating. You're about to hear details that challenge the public narrative. You're about to see angles the media never highlights. You're about to understand why Harry's request for help wasn't just a financial plea. It was a symbolic one. Because financial support wasn't the only thing he lost. In fact, the emotional weight of this moment is far more powerful than the money itself. But we'll get there soon. First, let's set up the emotional stakes. Picture Harry sitting alone in California, far from the protections he once took for granted. Imagine the frustration, the embarrassment, the internal conflict of knowing that the one person who always promised to protect you has finally said no. Now picture Charles, tired, overwhelmed, criticized, burdened by a monarchy that feels more fragile than ever. Imagine him facing a decision that satisfies the institution but breaks the father. Two men, two worlds, one irreversible decision. And here's where the story sharpens. Whispers say Charles received a message before cutting off the income, an email or phone call from someone unexpectedly close to Harry. A message that tipped the scales. A message that made Charles believe that protecting the monarchy required sacrificing something far more personal. Is that message real? Who sent it? What did it say? And why did it matter so much? That mystery sits at the center of this entire drama. And unlocking it requires us to go step by step through the chain of events that led to this moment. Which brings us to the pivotal turning point. The moment Harry discovered the income had been cut off. The moment that shook him deeply enough that he reached out for help. The moment that shaped everything that followed. But before we reveal what was cut and why, we need to start with the day everything changed. Because that day didn't just mark a financial shift. It was the beginning of something far bigger. Something no one close to the royal family saw coming. And what happened next changed everything. It started with a single message. A note, a text, a call. No one outside the inner circle knows exactly which. But for Prince Harry, it was enough to shatter his sense of security. One line, one phrase, and suddenly the world he had been building for himself in California felt like it was built on sand. Imagine waking up, scrolling through your notifications, expecting the usual mundane emails, flight confirmations, charity updates, or maybe a friendly message from a colleague. Instead, you find a notification that makes your stomach drop. That one email or phone call contained the news that would change everything. Your royal income, the support you had long relied on, had been shut down, permanently, with immediate effect. At first, Harry couldn't believe it. Surely, it was a mistake. Surely, there had to be a misunderstanding. But as the hours passed, it became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't an error. This was deliberate, strategic, personal. The reaction was instantaneous. Heart racing, chest tight, mind spinning through every scenario. What now? How would he maintain his commitments? What would Meghan think? And most importantly, why? Why would his own father, King Charles, take such a drastic step? To understand the full impact, it's crucial to contextualize just what this income represented. Royal finances are labyrinthine, complex, and often opaque. There are private allowances, duchy revenues, sovereign grants, and other benefits sprinkled with arcane rules only insiders can decipher. For Harry, the income wasn't just cash flow. It symbolized a connection to a life he once had, a link to family, a reassurance that despite everything, there was still a hand reaching toward him. That hand had now been withdrawn. Sources close to the family suggest the timing wasn't random. It coincided with several external pressures, a media cycle increasingly critical of Harry and Meghan, growing tensions within the palace regarding the balance between privacy and public duty, and the ongoing adjustment of royal finances under Charles's new reign. But even so, insiders say, the final decision carried a deeply personal undertone. It was a message that went beyond money. A clear signal that boundaries had been crossed, expectations had not been met, and trust had been broken. As Harry processed the news, a torrent of emotions flooded him. Shock, anger, confusion, a creeping sense of betrayal. But mixed in was something quieter, something heavier, a pang of fear. Not for his status or his lifestyle, but for the fragility of his own position within a family that he had once believed would always protect him. Because the reality is, no matter how independent Harry had tried to become, he had always been tethered, financially, socially, emotionally, to the family of which he was born. And now, those ties had been severed. In those first moments of realization, Harry is reported to have gone through an emotional roller coaster. First, disbelief. Then, denial. Perhaps this was temporary, a bureaucratic hiccup, something that would be reversed once the palace realized the mistake. But as the hours dragged on, the reality sank in. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intentional, and it was final. What happened next, according to insiders, was both frantic and methodical. Harry began retracing every interaction, every decision, every public statement he had made in recent months. Was it something he said in interviews? Something Meghan had suggested? Some unspoken slight or rebellion against palace expectations? He had to find a reason, a cause, a rationale. Humans crave patterns. We want meaning, especially when our lives are suddenly turned upside down. And in that instant, Harry's mind became a labyrinth of hypotheses, each one darker than the last. Meanwhile, the palace was operating on its own timeline. For Charles, the decision had been considered, debated, and executed with precision. Advisors argued. Financial experts outlined the implications. Lawyers reviewed the agreements. And through it all, the king reportedly maintained a calm exterior, a calm that belied the emotional and institutional weight of his choice. He had, by his own admission to confidence, reached a point where continuing financial support to Harry could no longer be reconciled with the needs of the monarchy. It was a line drawn in both sand and stone, a boundary meant to assert authority, control, and protection of an institution far bigger than any one individual. Back in California, Harry faced the practical realities immediately. Bills, staff salaries, philanthropic commitments, his family life. Every area of his carefully constructed independence was now under threat. The financial lifeline he had long assumed would remain, a constant in a shifting world, had been removed. And in its place, silence. It's easy to underestimate what that silence does to someone who is used to power, position, and expectation. A person like Harry has spent his life in the public eye, trained to manage crises, navigate optics, and maintain composure. Yet even the most resilient among us are human. And the loss of security, particularly the kind that comes from within a family, has a unique sting. It cuts deeper than headlines. It reverberates in the psyche. But Harry's response was not passive. According to insiders, he immediately began strategizing, weighing options. Call the family directly? Seek external support? Make a public statement? His instincts, honed over decades of media scrutiny, kicked in. But at the same time, there was the emotional undercurrent, hurt, disappointment, the sudden awareness of vulnerability. A vulnerability that the public rarely sees in the royal persona. As he sat, grappling with the new reality, one fact became terrifyingly clear. He had no backup, no safety net. The financial support was gone. The institutional support had faded. And the personal support he might have assumed was present, was conditional, distant, complicated. And yet, as dramatic as this moment was, it was only the beginning. Because when someone reaches the limits of desperation, choices begin to shift. People take risks they normally wouldn't. Calls are made. Messages are sent. Decisions that can't be undone are considered. And this is precisely what happened next. Harry, reports suggest, made a move that no one expected. Reaching out for help in a way that upended norms, challenged expectations, and set off a chain reaction that would ripple through both sides of the Atlantic. But what's truly fascinating is not just the act itself, it's the context behind it. Who did he call first? What did he ask for? And how did the person on the other end of the line respond? This call, trivial as it might seem at first glance, would mark the start of a new chapter in a saga that has already captivated the world for decades. Because the truth is, money was never the whole story. It was the symbol, The financial cutoff represented something far more significant: power, trust, and the delicate balance between family and institution. And in Harry's case, it represented a confrontation with reality that he had been able to postpone, but no longer. And as the day drew to a close, with the sun setting over Montecito, Harry faced a stark new reality. Nothing would ever be the same. Not his lifestyle, not his public image, not his sense of connection to the family he once knew, and certainly not his relationship with the father who had made this decision. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The headline said it simply: Prince Harry's royal income has been cut. But that description barely scratches the surface. Because when it comes to the British monarchy, income isn't a single, straightforward paycheck. It's a web of funds, streams, allowances, and legal agreements. Some public, some private, some buried in decades of institutional tradition. And in Harry's case, what was taken away was far more than money. It was a piece of his identity, a symbol of connection to a family and life he once held dear. To understand the magnitude of the loss, we need to break it down. Harry's finances were complex, layered, and tied to multiple sources. There was the private allowance from his father, stemming from the Duchy of Cornwall. There were revenues from personal investments, property holdings, and public speaking contracts. And then there were funds tied directly to his royal roles, grants, ceremonial payments, and contributions to charities associated with the crown. Some of these were straightforward. Others were entangled with agreements made decades ago, designed to ensure financial stability for family members while maintaining the public image of the monarchy. When Charles reportedly decided to cut off Harry, the primary target was the private allowance from the Duchy of Cornwall. This was not just discretionary money. It was intended to support Harry's official royal duties, his charitable work, and his family life. Insiders say the allowance had been carefully calibrated over years, providing enough to maintain a high standard of living while avoiding excessive reliance on public funds. Losing it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a seismic shift. Imagine the practical implications: house staff, security teams, philanthropic commitments, travel, lifestyle, even day-to-day expenditures suddenly became a source of stress. According to sources close to Harry, the immediate effect was a scramble to reassess budgets, contracts, and obligations. The financial cushion he had long relied upon, the reassurance that, regardless of his personal ventures, the family would provide support if needed, was gone. And the speed with which this decision was executed left him little room to prepare. But the symbolic weight was even greater. Harry had long tried to strike a balance, asserting independence while remaining connected to the family of his birth. The allowance represented more than just money. It represented recognition, acceptance, and a bond that survived distance and conflict. Cutting it off sent a clear message. That bond was now conditional, fragile, and negotiable. In one move, Harry's father had drawn a line, signaling a recalibration of both trust and responsibility. This decision also exposed contradictions in the public narrative. For years, Harry had positioned himself as independent, financially self-sufficient, and able to thrive outside the constraints of the monarchy. Yet this sudden cutoff highlighted the fragility of that independence. Even someone as prominent and successful as Harry relied, at least in part, on family support. The public image of self-reliance met the private reality of reliance on the institution he had left behind. And it wasn't just the allowance itself. Reports indicate that certain benefits tied to the duchy's resources, security provisions, property maintenance, and even access to advisors were curtailed or renegotiated simultaneously. The combined effect was more than financial. It was logistical, emotional, and strategic. Suddenly, Harry faced the practical challenge of navigating life in the U.S. without the same infrastructure that had made his transition from royal life smoother. The loss was immediate and tangible. To make matters more complicated, there were layers of secrecy and legal nuance. The allowance wasn't public, and its reduction or elimination wasn't formally announced in a way that explained the rationale. For Harry, this meant he had to navigate not just the practical consequences, but also the narrative implications. How to explain changes in lifestyle, commitments, or projects without exposing the raw personal conflict at the heart of the matter. how to protect his public image while grappling with private disappointment and frustration. And then there was the emotional dimension. Losing an income tied directly to your father carries psychological weight. It signals disapproval, disappointment, and sometimes judgment. Harry had to process the implicit messages, a sense of disconnection, perhaps a perceived failure to meet expectations, and a reminder of his place within the hierarchy of the family. Unlike other financial setbacks, this one carried a familial sting. Money may be replaceable, but trust and connection, particularly with one's parent, are far more complicated to repair. Sources suggest that Harry's initial response combined pragmatism with disbelief. He immediately began analyzing his remaining resources, considering alternative revenue streams, and rethinking spending priorities. At the same time, he reportedly reached out to advisors, friends, and colleagues to understand the full scope of what had been withdrawn. But the emotional reality was stark. The lifeline he had relied on was gone, and with it, a sense of security he had taken for granted. It's also worth noting that this was not the first time the family had sent signals about financial boundaries. Harry had long been aware of limitations, expectations, and conditions attached to royal support. But this time, insiders say, the decision carried a sharper edge. It wasn't merely a recalibration, it was a definitive statement. A clear indication that independence comes with consequences, and that the price of distance from the monarchy is measured not just in public appearances, but in private resources. So what does this mean for someone like Harry? The immediate challenges were obvious: manage expenses, renegotiate contracts, secure alternative support. But the deeper implications were more profound. Reassess relationships, reconsider strategies, and navigate a delicate balance between self-preservation and familial duty. Every decision, every move, every interaction became layered with tension. Because now, financial considerations weren't just numbers. They were symbols of loyalty, authority, and connection. And here's the part that the public rarely sees. Even in moments of financial independence, emotional dependency lingers. The allowance, as symbolic as it was, represented reassurance that Harry's place in the family and his bond with Charles remained intact. Removing it was more than money lost. It was trust-tested. It was a boundary enforced. It was a reminder that the father-son relationship, like the monarchy itself, is governed by rules, expectations, and consequences. But even as the initial shock settled, one fact became apparent. This decision would set off a chain reaction. Contracts would need renegotiation, public appearances reconsidered, family dynamics recalibrated, and personal strategies revised. Harry faced a moment of reckoning: adapt or falter, navigate the consequences or let them define him. And that is precisely where we leave him at the end of this chapter. Confronted with the stark reality of loss, forced to grapple with both practical and emotional implications, and standing on the precipice of decisions that would affect not just his finances, but his identity, his relationships, and his future. But what Harry didn't yet understand, and what would unfold in the hours and days to come, was that this financial cutoff was only the beginning. Because every decision has a backstory, and every consequence carries a secret. And in this case, the secret was one that would change not just his bank account, but his understanding of his father, his family, and his place in the world. Every relationship has unspoken rules. Every family has expectations, promises, and boundaries that often go unexamined, until the moment they are broken. For Prince Harry and King Charles, one such promise existed, buried deep in the history of their father-son bond. One that seemed minor at first, but would later resurface with devastating consequences. It was years ago, in the relatively quiet period before Harry met Meghan, before headlines about royal scandals dominated international news, that Harry made a pledge to his father. According to multiple sources, it wasn't a grand public promise. It wasn't something televised or printed in tabloids. It was private, between father and son, and it carried the weight of expectation. A commitment to maintain certain standards of discretion, loyalty, and adherence to royal protocols, even when living a life outside the formal constraints of the monarchy. At the time, the promise seemed reasonable. Harry was young, ambitious, idealistic, and confident. He had witnessed his mother's life and death. and had a deep desire to chart his own path without repeating past mistakes. The promise, on the surface, was a compromise, a way to maintain family ties while exploring personal freedom. He agreed, he nodded, he reassured. To Charles, it was a signal that his son would honor family expectations, even at a distance. To Harry, it seemed like a manageable boundary, a line drawn in the sand that could accommodate both independence and kinship. Years later, that same promise would resurface. Not as a recollection, but as a judgment. It became the lens through which Charles interpreted Harry's actions, statements, and alliances. In the eyes of the king, the promise had been broken. By failing to maintain certain boundaries publicly, by engaging in media interviews, podcasts, and business ventures that challenged the monarchy's image, Harry had crossed a line. From Charles's perspective, the breach wasn't minor. It was a significant act of disloyalty, a challenge to the structure of authority and familial trust. And yet, from Harry's side, the interpretation was different. He saw the promise as a mutual understanding, one flexible enough to allow personal growth, experimentation, and advocacy. He believed the intention mattered more than the letter. He believed that living authentically, openly, and publicly did not equate to betrayal. In fact, he felt a moral responsibility to speak about experiences, causes, and truths that mattered to him, regardless of royal optics. This disconnect between intention and perception was the spark that would ignite the larger conflict. Think about that for a moment. How often do we make promises we believe are fair, only to discover years later that someone else's interpretation is far stricter than our own? Now imagine the stakes magnified by centuries of tradition, global scrutiny, and the weight of a monarchy that observes every word, every action, every expression. For Harry, the consequences were not abstract. They were personal, financial, and emotional. The promise he had made, or thought he had fulfilled, was suddenly being cited as justification for cutting off his income. The story doesn't end there. According to insiders, what hurt Harry most wasn't the financial repercussion itself, but the implication behind it, that his father had judged him, had evaluated his worthiness, and had determined that past actions, some decades old, were grounds for punitive action. It wasn't simply a policy decision. It was, in Harry's perception, a statement about who he was as a son. At the same time, Charles reportedly felt compelled to act decisively. Advisors had warned him for years that unchecked independence could erode both family cohesion and institutional authority. They argued that public critiques, media appearances, and business ventures had the potential to destabilize not only the monarchy's image, but also its financial structure. In this light, the broken promise was more than personal. It became institutional. It justified, in Charles's mind, a clear line. Financial support would only continue under certain conditions, and those conditions had not been met. The tension between father and son escalated gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Small disagreements over appearances, speeches, and philanthropic endeavors built into months of subtle friction. Harry felt increasingly misunderstood. Charles felt increasingly undermined. Over time, the emotional distance widened into a chasm, one that formal promises could no longer bridge. And the day the allowance was cut marked the culmination of that distance, the visible manifestation of a relationship that had been deteriorating quietly for years. What makes this dynamic particularly fascinating is the interplay between perception and reality. Harry's life outside the monarchy was full of challenges, risks, and public scrutiny. He had, in many ways, sacrificed privacy and security to assert independence. Yet from Charles's perspective, those sacrifices didn't count. What mattered was adherence to a promise, a standard of conduct, and the preservation of institutional integrity. The collision of these two frameworks, Harry's personal morality versus Charles's institutional duty, created a perfect storm. It's also worth noting that this promise, while private, became a reference point for other members of the royal family. Conversations behind closed doors often returned to the theme of loyalty and obligation. Advisors and confidants reportedly reminded Charles that supporting Harry financially without accountability could set a precedent that might embolden other family members. In this context, the decision to cut the income was not simply punitive. It was strategic, designed to maintain structure within a family where personal decisions often have public repercussions. Yet for Harry, the emotional impact was profound. Beyond money, beyond logistics, beyond contracts and obligations, the severance represented a personal failure, or at least the perception of one. He had tried to balance independence with loyalty. He had believed he could honor the spirit of the promise without compromising his values. And yet, here he was, confronted with the consequences of a broken understanding he hadn't intended to break. And that's what makes this chapter so pivotal. Because the financial cutoff wasn't just about resources. It was a culmination of years of miscommunication, unmet expectations, and unresolved grief. It forced both father and son to confront uncomfortable truths about their relationship, about loyalty, and about the cost of choices made under pressure and scrutiny. By the end of this day, Harry faced a new reality. Promises, no matter how carefully made, are only as strong as the interpretations and expectations that follow them. And for him, that reality meant navigating a world where personal values, public perception, and familial bonds collided in a way that left no simple path forward. But even as he grappled with this personal and financial upheaval, one fact became clear. The promise that had been broken was not the only factor at play. There were other forces, unseen and unspoken, influencing Charles's decision, forces that would soon reveal themselves and shift the entire trajectory of Harry's journey. And what came next, this unseen influence, this hidden factor, would change everything about how Harry saw his father, his family, and the world he had chosen to live in. What drives a king to make a decision that cuts off his own son? On the surface, it might appear cold, calculated, or even harsh. But peel back the layers, and you find a complex mixture of duty, emotion, strategy, and centuries-old tradition, a combination that few outside the palace can truly understand. Charles's decision to terminate Prince Harry's royal income was never just about money. It was about control, precedent, and the delicate balancing act of preserving an institution while managing personal relationships. And at the heart of it all was a father trying to reconcile love with responsibility. From the start, Charles's reasoning was rooted in his dual roles, as a father and as the sovereign. As a father, he had always been acutely aware of the fragility of his relationship with Harry. From the early years of shared grief after Princess Diana's death to the tensions created by media scrutiny and family expectations, Charles had faced countless moments where his son's independence clashed with his own understanding of loyalty. Each incident added a layer of complexity, a subtle accumulation of strain that never fully dissipated. The promise Harry had once made, the one discussed in Chapter 3, remained in Charles's mind as both a guidepost and a standard. In his view, that promise had been broken multiple times. Inaction or indulgence would have sent the wrong signal. At the same time, Charles had the weight of the monarchy pressing down on every decision. Unlike ordinary parents, his choices carried not just familial consequences, but institutional ones. Supporting Harry indefinitely, despite perceived breaches of trust or protocol, could create a precedent that undermined the authority of the monarchy. Advisors reportedly reminded him that failing to enforce boundaries could be interpreted by the public, media, and other family members as weakness. In the high-stakes world of the royal family, perception often matters as much as reality. Charles also faced a generational shift. The monarchy is evolving under his leadership, and he is acutely aware of the scrutiny placed upon him. Every action, particularly involving high-profile family members like Harry and Meghan, is dissected, analyzed, and debated globally. In this environment, decisions must balance compassion with optics, fairness with strategy. Cutting off Harry's allowance, painful as it was perceived by Charles as necessary to maintain both the dignity of the institution and the clarity of familial expectations. Insiders suggest that Charles weighed multiple factors before finalizing the decision. He considered Harry's financial independence, or lack thereof, his public statements, his business endeavors, and the impact of his media appearances on the monarchy's reputation. Each element, in Charles's eyes, compounded the need for action. The allowance was not merely a financial arrangement. It was an instrument of accountability, a tangible measure of the link between personal responsibility and institutional support. When Harry's actions were perceived as straying from agreed-upon boundaries, the instrument needed recalibration. But Charles's decision was not purely rational or administrative. Emotion played a critical role. Sources close to the palace describe a man torn between love for his son and a profound sense of duty to the crown. The choice was not easy. Charles reportedly agonized over the potential fallout, aware that financial and emotional consequences would ripple far beyond the immediate family. He understood that Harry might perceive the move as punitive or hostile, that Meghan might interpret it as a slight, and that public perception could complicate the monarchy's image. The tension between personal and institutional responsibilities weighed heavily on him. What's particularly interesting is the advisory process leading up to the decision. Charles reportedly consulted senior aides, financial advisors, and close confidants, each offering perspectives rooted in history, policy, and strategy. Some warned that severing Harry's support could provoke backlash, deepen resentment, and attract media criticism. Others argued that continued financial support without accountability risked signaling favoritism, undermining the authority of the king, and potentially encouraging further public controversies. In the end, Charles made a choice that balanced these competing pressures, but leaned toward protecting the long-term stability of the monarchy over short-term personal comfort. Despite the careful planning, Charles's decision carried emotional consequences that no advisor could fully mitigate. Cutting off his son was not a neutral act. It was a declaration, one that carried implicit judgment. The message was clear: loyalty, responsibility, and adherence to family and institutional expectations matter, and failure to meet them has consequences. The financial withdrawal was as much symbolic as practical. It conveyed disappointment, a boundary, and a test of character, all at once. Yet even within this decisiveness, there were moments of reflection and doubt. Sources suggest that Charles privately acknowledged the possibility of regret. Would Harry perceive the act as betrayal? Would the public understand the reasoning, or would they only see estrangement? Could there have been an alternative, a compromise, a path that preserved both financial support and familial connection? These questions, according to insiders, lingered in the king's mind long after the decision was executed. Charles's private reasoning was also shaped by a sense of historical responsibility. As the reigning monarch, he is acutely aware that his decisions set precedents for future generations. How he treats Harry, how the monarchy responds to public and private challenges, and how boundaries are enforced all carry lessons for heirs, siblings, and cousins who watch these dynamics closely. In his mind, leniency or inaction could ripple into broader consequences for the family and the institution. Maintaining clarity, consistency, and authority became paramount. And yet, there was a deeply human dimension to the decision. Charles reportedly acknowledged the personal pain it would cause, the sense of rejection Harry would feel, and the strain it would place on a relationship already marked by distance. He is described as conflicted, a father navigating the intersection of love, duty, and consequence. This was not a decision made lightly, nor one without emotional cost. For Charles, the act of cutting off Harry's income was a paradox, necessary to maintain order, but painful precisely because of the bond it affected. At the end of the day, Charles's private reasoning can be summarized as a convergence of three forces: obligation to the monarchy, adherence to principle, and the complexities of fatherhood. Each influenced the other, and each carried weight in his decision-making. Money, while central to the practical impact, was only a proxy for deeper issues: trust, accountability, and the balance between independence and loyalty. The allowance was both symbol and instrument, a tangible representation of family ties, institutional authority, and the expectations that connect the two. And yet, even as Charles implemented the decision, insiders suggest he anticipated an immediate response. He knew Harry would not accept the change quietly. He expected confusion, frustration, and perhaps even anger. But he also believed the choice would clarify expectations, enforce boundaries, and, ultimately, protect both the monarchy and the family in the long term. But what Charles could not predict, and what would soon unfold, was how Harry would respond. Not merely as a son seeking financial stability, but as a man grappling with a profound emotional upheaval, a public identity crisis, and a relationship fractured by years of miscommunication. The king's reasoning, meticulous and deliberate as it was, could not fully contain the personal consequences. And that is where the story truly begins. Because Charles's carefully reasoned decision, executed with precision, deliberation, and a sense of duty, set in motion a series of events that neither father nor son could have fully anticipated. Decisions made in the quiet chambers of the palace would ripple across oceans, headlines, and family dynamics, reaching a moment where every choice, every expectation, and every promise would collide. And what came next, the moment Harry realized the full impact of his father's reasoning, would push him toward actions that no one, not even Charles himself, saw coming. The day Prince Harry realized his royal income had been cut off marked more than just a financial shift. It marked a breaking point, a moment where the weight of past grievances, unhealed wounds, and the pressures of public life converged to create a crisis that was as emotional as it was practical. Desperation, unlike anger or disappointment, is silent, creeping, and profoundly destabilizing. And in Harry's case, it settled over him like a storm. At first, he tried to process the news logically. He reviewed budgets, assessed remaining resources, and considered ways to offset the loss. Staff salaries, property expenses, security measures, philanthropic obligations. Each item became a point of tension. But Harry quickly realized that the logistics were only part of the problem. The financial cut wasn't just about money. It was about identity, independence, and trust. Losing it felt like a withdrawal of validation, a statement that the father he admired and the family he once depended on no longer recognized him as fully capable or worthy. The emotional toll was immediate. Friends close to Harry describe him as alternating between disbelief and a creeping sense of isolation. The public persona, the confident, composed prince, was stripped away behind closed doors. In its place was a man grappling with vulnerability, uncertainty, and the deep psychological weight of rejection. Imagine the scenario: a life carefully curated to balance independence with familial ties suddenly destabilized, the one source of reassurance withdrawn without warning. For Harry, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a blow to his sense of self. This moment of desperation also intersected with Harry's very public life. He had cultivated a persona as a modern royal, a family man, and a philanthropist. Contracts, media appearances, and public commitments were tied to expectations of financial stability and credibility. The sudden loss of income threatened not only his personal life, but his professional standing and public image. Every decision, every engagement, every project now carried the shadow of uncertainty. The stakes had grown exponentially. Friends and confidants reportedly observed Harry oscillating between anger, regret, and frantic strategizing. Questions raced through his mind. How had he misjudged the situation? What signals had he missed? Could he have avoided this outcome? And crucially, who could he turn to for help now that the family he once counted on had withdrawn their support? The emotional intensity was compounded by the public nature of his life. Unlike most people facing financial setbacks, Harry had no private bubble in which to retreat. Every misstep, every expression of frustration, risked becoming fodder for global media scrutiny. The breaking point, insiders suggest, was compounded by months, if not years, of simmering tension. Harry had long felt misunderstood by his father, constrained by traditions he viewed as outdated, and scrutinized by institutions he believed prioritized protocol over personal relationships. The allowance had been a symbol of connection, a tangible reassurance that despite disagreements and distance, a bond remained. Its removal was more than a practical matter. It was a signal that the bond itself was fragile, negotiable, and conditional. But desperation has a way of catalyzing action. Where rational thinking meets emotional intensity, choices are forced, often in directions previously unconsidered. Harry, faced with this abrupt severance, began reaching out to advisors, friends, and intermediaries. He sought counsel, explored alternatives, and weighed strategies with the intensity of someone staring down a critical juncture in their life. It was a mix of survival instincts and emotional reckoning. He needed solutions, but he also needed understanding and reassurance. At the same time, Harry's relationship with Meghan added a new layer of complexity. She was not just a partner, but an active collaborator, someone with influence over decisions and perception management. Insiders suggest that discussions between them became heated, emotional, and strategic. The couple weighed public response against private vulnerability. They debated messaging, legal avenues, and potential media engagement. And they grappled with the paradox of maintaining dignity while facing a sudden, involuntary financial dependency on decisions made by a father whose judgment they now questioned. But the emotional stakes went even deeper. Losing financial support from his father meant confronting unresolved feelings, grief over past losses, frustration at perceived injustices, and the weight of legacy and expectation. Harry was forced to face the duality of his life. The freedom he sought outside the monarchy and the tether he could never fully escape. Desperation, in this sense, was as much about identity as it was about money. It was about belonging, recognition, and the painful realization that the ties of family could also be the source of profound vulnerability. The hours and days following the cutoff reportedly blurred together. Harry moved between tasks, conversations, and strategizing, all while navigating the psychological weight of rejection. Emotional spikes alternated with moments of introspection. Friends described nights of sleeplessness, early morning reflection, and the recurring thought, "What now?" Each day magnified the urgency to find a solution, to regain agency, and to reassert some form of control over circumstances suddenly thrust upon him. It was in this crucible of pressure, isolation, and emotional intensity that Harry made a critical decision to reach out. Not for money, not for validation, but for support of any kind. To seek guidance, perspective, and a lifeline in a moment when the stability he had assumed for so long had disappeared. The act itself was symbolic. It was a concession to vulnerability, a recognition that independence has limits, and a willingness to confront the human need for connection, even from someone he had vowed to avoid depending on. And yet, this call, this reaching out, would mark a turning point. It was more than a practical move. It was a psychological shift, a pivot from isolation to engagement, from frustration to action, from passive endurance to strategic planning. The choices made in the wake of this desperation would ripple outward, affecting not just finances, but relationships, public image, and future opportunities. Harry's breaking point became the catalyst for the next phase of a story defined by tension, emotion, and high stakes. But here's the most critical detail. Desperation can be both a danger and an opportunity. In Harry's case, the urgency of the moment forced him to consider paths he might otherwise have resisted. And the first step, making that call, initiating that conversation, was the first domino in a chain reaction that neither he nor Charles could have anticipated. The outcome would challenge assumptions, reveal hidden truths, and set the stage for confrontations, alliances, and revelations that would change the course of the family dynamic forever. And what came next, the person Harry turned to for help, and the shocking advice he received, would completely reshape his understanding of loyalty, power, and the cost of independence. But no one, not even Harry, knew the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The moment of desperation had passed. The storm of initial disbelief, panic, and emotional upheaval had begun to settle, leaving Prince Harry with a stark reality. He needed help. Not just financial help, but guidance, reassurance, and clarity. And in that instant, the only person he could reach out to was the one who had cut him off, his father, King Charles. It wasn't an easy choice. For a man who had cultivated independence, autonomy, and a public persona of strength, asking for help felt like both a betrayal and a risk. Yet the human instinct to survive, to protect family, and to reclaim agency is stronger than pride. Harry's decision to pick up the phone, or perhaps send that first message, was both practical and deeply personal. It was a plea, a test, and a reconnection all rolled into one. Sources close to the family suggest that Harry's initial outreach was cautious. He didn't demand money, argue, or lash out. Instead, he framed the call around support, understanding, and perhaps even reconciliation. He knew the stakes. The public eye was always watching, the media ready to dissect every syllable, and the family dynamics already tense. One wrong word could escalate the situation, inflame advisors, or create irreversible damage. Imagine the psychological calculus involved. Harry had to weigh emotion against strategy, urgency against diplomacy, and personal need against public perception. Every phrase, every tone, every pause mattered. This wasn't just a conversation between father and son. It was a test of boundaries, influence, and the fragile bridge that still connected them. Meanwhile, Charles's perspective was equally complex. Reports indicate that when he received the call, the king approached it with a mix of caution, skepticism, and lingering paternal concern. On one hand, he had just enforced a decision he believed necessary for both family and institution. On the other, he understood that this call might represent a genuine attempt at dialogue, a recognition of missteps, or even a chance to repair the relationship. But as Charles listened, the layers of emotion, history, and expectation unfolded, complicating the interaction in ways few could predict. Insiders claim that the initial conversation was tense, yet measured. Harry conveyed urgency, frustration, and a need for guidance, while Charles maintained a composed exterior, emphasizing responsibility, boundaries, and the principles behind his decision. The dialogue reportedly oscillated between candid emotional expressions and careful negotiation, each man navigating a minefield of history, expectation, and public scrutiny. One key aspect of this call, according to sources, was Harry's appeal to shared history. He reminded Charles of their bond, the grief they had endured together, and the moments when loyalty had been mutual. He framed his request not as a demand, but as a recognition of a shared past and a hope for continued connection. This tactic, blending vulnerability with strategic positioning, was characteristic of Harry's approach in high-stakes interactions. Yet the call also revealed the depth of misunderstanding between father and son. Charles interpreted certain statements as defensive or challenging, while Harry perceived caution and restraint as distance or judgment. The clash of interpretation highlights a recurring theme in their relationship: the struggle to reconcile personal intent with perceived action, emotion with duty, and independence with familial expectation. As the conversation progressed, both men reportedly began to confront the emotional consequences of the financial severance. For Harry, it wasn't simply about the loss of income. It was about trust, validation, and the fragile perception of being valued by his father. For Charles, it was about maintaining authority, upholding institutional integrity, and navigating the complex moral landscape of parenting a high-profile adult child. The call became a microcosm of the broader tension, a blend of money, emotion, and the weight of public duty. And yet, despite the tension, a subtle shift occurred. As the conversation unfolded, Harry's vulnerability began to resonate. Charles reportedly recognized the depth of his son's emotional struggle, the stakes of isolation, and the genuine need for guidance. This recognition didn't erase the decision he had made, but it introduced an element of possibility, a chance for dialogue, negotiation, or at least temporary understanding. This moment, the call itself, was pivotal. It marked a transition from passive endurance to proactive engagement, from frustration to strategic action. Harry was no longer merely reacting to circumstances. He was actively navigating a path forward, testing boundaries, and attempting to repair a relationship strained by years of distance and miscommunication. But, crucially, the call also set the stage for complications. According to insiders, advisors on both sides monitored the interaction closely, offering guidance, warnings, and instructions on messaging, tone, and next steps. The presence of intermediaries, even indirectly, added layers of pressure. Every word carried potential consequences, both personal and institutional. The simple act of reaching out was therefore infused with risk, requiring careful balance between emotional honesty and strategic calculation. And yet, the most surprising element of this outreach was what came next, a revelation during the conversation that neither Harry nor Charles had anticipated. While neither side expected immediate resolution, the discussion opened a door to information, advice, and perhaps even opportunities that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Harry's next steps. It was a moment that combined vulnerability, courage, and tactical thinking. a moment where desperation met action and created unexpected possibility. Even as the call ended, both men were left with questions, tensions, and new insights. Harry had articulated his needs, expressed his frustration, and tested his father's response. Charles had reaffirmed boundaries, expressed paternal concern, and navigated the delicate balance between authority and empathy. The conversation closed with neither a complete reconciliation nor a full resolution, but with the spark of potential, a dynamic that would evolve in ways that few could foresee. And here's the cliffhanger. According to reports, what Harry learned during this call, the advice, the response, and the unspoken messages, would inform his next decisions in ways that would challenge the monarchy, his own independence, and the fragile bond with his father. The call was not the end. It was the beginning of a series of choices that would redefine relationships, finances, and public perception. But what came next? The move Harry made immediately after the call, and the consequences that rippled from it, would surprise everyone, both inside and outside the royal family. And that is where the story escalates, revealing layers of strategy, emotion, and family tension that no one saw coming. By the time Prince Harry had made the call to his father, the stage was set for a complex network of forces, advisors, intermediaries, and whispers behind closed doors that would amplify tension and shape the unfolding drama. What the public sees as a private dispute between father and son is, in reality, a web of counsel, influence, and strategy designed to protect the monarchy, manage public perception, and, sometimes unintentionally, heighten the emotional stakes for those at the center. Advisors in the royal household wield significant influence, often operating quietly, unseen, and unacknowledged by the public. Their role is multifaceted. They manage logistics, craft messaging, provide guidance on protocol, and sometimes act as buffers between family members. But in cases like Harry's, their presence adds complexity. Every word, action, or decision can be subtly directed, reframed, or escalated by these unseen hands. A seemingly personal choice, like a phone call to a father, can become entangled in a chain of strategic advice, shifting the emotional and practical landscape in ways the principals themselves may not fully realize. Sources suggest that in the aftermath of the call, advisors on both sides were deeply involved. Harry's team, including private consultants, legal advisors, and trusted friends, scrutinized every word of the interaction, assessing potential outcomes and planning contingencies. At the same time, palace advisors monitored the conversation from their own vantage point, ready to intervene if messages were misinterpreted or if public leaks threatened to alter the narrative. Every party understood that the stakes were not merely familial. They were institutional, financial, and global. Leaks, too, became a pivotal factor in this unfolding drama. History has shown that within the royal world, information rarely stays contained. Confidential discussions, internal frustrations, and strategic decisions often find their way into media outlets, intentionally or otherwise. For Harry and Charles, the existence of leaks meant that private moments, like the desperate phone call, carried the additional weight of potential public scrutiny. Every phrase had the power to be dissected, spun, or weaponized, and both sides were acutely aware that reputation, trust, and credibility were on the line. The strategic use of advisors and leaks is not inherently malicious. Often, it serves as a protective mechanism, a way to manage risk, and a tool to maintain order in a high-stakes environment. Yet the effect on Harry was profound. Sources close to him describe a sense of paranoia, frustration, and mistrust. He knew the palace operated with layers of oversight, influence, and reporting that he could not always see or control. The very act of reaching out to his father, intended to be private and emotionally honest, became a complex performance under observation. Every sentiment had to be filtered, every nuance evaluated, every potential consequence anticipated. At the same time, advisors sometimes play a contradictory role. Some encourage openness and emotional expression, while others prioritize strategy, optics, and control. For Harry, this duality was emotionally exhausting. He wanted connection, empathy, and understanding. Yet he was constantly reminded that in the royal ecosystem, emotions are subordinate to strategy, perception, and the long-term stability of the institution. It created a tension that few outside the palace could truly grasp, a push and pull between personal needs and institutional demands. Leaks, whether intentional or accidental, compounded this tension. Insiders claim that snippets of conversations, decisions, and disputes occasionally surfaced in media reports, often framed to highlight conflict or disagreement. For Harry, this meant that his privacy was compromised, his emotional vulnerability was exposed, and every decision carried the risk of public judgment. The strategic environment became a pressure cooker. Personal, financial, and reputational stakes all interlinked, creating a dynamic where one misstep could escalate into a full-blown crisis. Interestingly, advisors themselves are not a monolith. Within the palace, some act as advocates for Harry, emphasizing reconciliation, dialogue, and fairness. Others act as protectors of protocol and tradition, emphasizing boundaries, institutional stability, and the long-term implications of financial or public concessions. This internal diversity creates both opportunity and risk. For Harry, it meant that advice was rarely straightforward. Decisions had to navigate multiple perspectives, often conflicting, and rarely aligned entirely with his personal instincts. And then there's the matter of timing. Leaks, advisors, and strategic interventions do not operate in a vacuum. They intersect with public events, media cycles, and global attention. The timing of a conversation, the phrasing of a message, or the decision to intervene can dramatically shift outcomes. In Harry's situation, every interaction was magnified. The call to Charles was not merely a private plea. It was a potential news story, a strategic test, and a point of observation for a global audience. The advisor's influence extended into the shadows, shaping what would happen next in ways the public could barely imagine.